Adam McCombs.
Howdy, howdy. Thanks, Steve, for that great introduction. I think you've got a future in this. My name is Adam McCombs. I run the Taecho group with Robert Bond. We're a small agency in San Marcos. We specialize in web applications and e-commerce websites. We do a lot of work with PHP, CodeIgniter, Expression Engine. Those are our bread and butter. I'm a designer at heart. I come from a design background. Now I'm moving more into sort of biz dev as we grow our business. But in the end, I still do design. I still write CSS code. And a couple months ago, I stumbled upon Less. And just to highlight some of the things we're going to talk about tonight, we're going to do an introduction to Less. We're going to talk about variables, mixin, nested rules, deployments, the up and downs of using Less, and kind of set the story straight in terms of using Less, using SAS, and these other preprocessors that are out there for CSS. So first off, Less is a CSS preprocessor that allows you to write CSS code faster. And in basic, it's like magic. So everybody's seen this. You're probably tired of writing the same CSS code over and over and over and over again. I was too. And so what you can do with Less is Less allows you to have a little magic, and you basically turn the top section into the bottom section. So you can turn a whole string of shortcuts into a single word. You can go to the actual site if you want to look it up. The documentation for Less is great. It's lesscss.org. One thing I will say before we dive in, Less is only one CSS preprocessor. There's SAS, there's Compass, there's Stylus. So there's a lot of different flavors out there, so you really have to do the research and find the right preprocessor that's going to work for you. Each one of them has a different syntax, a different language. I like Less. Obviously I'm giving this talk, but it's lightweight, it's customizable, and I think it's a great tool to use for your front-end development. So like I said, Less gives you three main functions, abilities, I guess you could call them that. There's variables, mixin, and nested rules. There's also functions and operators, and that is self-explanatory. You can divide, multiply, any type of math operations, but that's crazy. That gets a little bit too complex in my mind. So starting off, variables. This is the strongest thing. This is the heart of Less. So I don't know about you, but I don't have that many hex codes memorized. And when you're working on a project, sometimes you might be working with really obscure hex codes in terms of reds, blues, greens, and trying to remember that and paste those in or copy and paste those over and over and over again just blows your mind. But what you can remember is you can remember things like red, green, blue. So what you do with Less is you essentially can set your variables, and you can say red is this hex color. And by doing that, you can set that hex color once and forget about it. So you can set red, blue, you can do a whole array of them. And then in your CSS code, you don't have to remember a 6-digit hex code. You can just call that shortcut, and it'll inject it for you. And we'll get into how it does, the magic of how it does that later. But that's the first one, is variables. So this is just showing what you can do as variables. And it can be any string, any item that you have trouble remembering or don't want to type over and over and over again. Usually I use it for colors, and there's other things you can do, specific dimensions, rotations, things like that. Those will help you sort of be your brain, so you don't have to think about those over and over and over again as you're working in the same CSS file. The next step is to take those variables and do what Les calls mixins. And this is where it gets to get a little hairy. Mixins are essentially classes that you stuff inside of other classes. So say you're used to, like, everybody uses border radius or have at some point. It gets real tiring to write out border radius, WebKit, Mozilla, etc., and then give the percentages for each of those over and over and over again. So what you can do is you can actually define it as a class and then come back and call that same class again later on. And what will happen is what you set up here, this is actually doing both a mixin and a variable. So it's doing rounded corners is the mixin, but the variable that you set, the radius, we've already set that as 5 pixels. So what's going to happen is anytime you call rounded corners, it's going to inject a radius of 5 pixels in those 3 different locations. So when the compiled CSS comes out, you get all of that in a nice, neat little package. So all you're really typing is 1 word or 2 words, and it'll output a whole string for you. Next thing you can do with less is you can do what's called nested rules, and you can give your CSS some hierarchy. There's a little bit of pent-upness about doing hierarchy in CSS. For some people this will work well, so for some people it won't. So instead of defining your same ID or class over and over and over and over again, you can stack them. So essentially you can say header, and then go to your H1, and then it's going to automatically put header H1 output for you. So you can stack those classes over and over and over again, and all of those classes that are children, I guess you could say, will be outputted with the original header. Now, this is where it gets a little crazy, but you can start adding less to your font setup, and this will allow you to, first, you define a variable. That variable might be a particular font. This is a font I use pretty often. It's called dim, and this particular weight is called dim black. So what I did is I set dim black as a variable, and I go ahead and call that same variable in add font face, and then I use a mixin. And so what's really cool about this is you can take that mixin, and that mixin could be dim black, dim italic, dim small, and so you can come up with these design patterns that are 1 word. So if your string, your mixin is this long 2 lines, 3 lines of CSS code, you can define that as 1 word. And so when you go to write the CSS, you get really, really fast in terms of the classes and the properties that you're giving to these IDs that you're working down the style sheet. So you start to create these shortcuts for yourself. So you don't have to remember these crazy complex CSS lines. You just remember dim black or a variable. You know, just inject those, and it'll output all of this CSS code for you. This is another one that also combines a mixin with a variable, and this allows you to, say if you're going to call border radius custom is the example right here, and this allows you to predetermine border radius custom. As default, it'll give you 5 pixels in every one, but if you want to follow that back up and give unique properties or unique variables for top left, top right, top, bottom right, and all that, you can define those on the fly. So you can actually do mixins and variables as you're working through your CSS sheet. And that allows you to keep one style, keep one mixin as you're working all the way down, but you might have an area that's got a smaller radius or a bigger radius, and you can change those as you're working with the different elements. So, talk about deployments now, and once you've got all of this great less library that you've built up, elements, whatever you want to call it, there's a couple different ways to get it out on the web. You can run client-side, and client-side does a translation using JavaScript and basically takes your less file, translates it to CSS, and injects it in a header. There's a bit of debate that we might get into a little bit later about how that works. There's server-side usage, which we'll talk about in a second, and then there's always processing your less file on your local host into CSS. And you can do that through an online converter, and there's several other applications you can use that are great applications to convert that for you. So first up is talking about doing a less deployment on the client side. So there's a lot of debate in terms of you should never deploy a less file, and it's terrible for performance, and I definitely want to talk to anybody who has that quirk. I know there are a lot of JavaScript gurus out in the audience that will hate this, but essentially what happens is you link to a styles.less file, and it's just like a CSS file. You link to a less.js file, and you profit. So what happens is you have this less file with all these variables and all these mixins. The less.js will take that, process all of those variables, mixin, and output regular CSS. Now, a couple of notes about this, why people don't care for this is A, it does require JavaScript. You have to have JavaScript on it. Two, there's no error checking. And this is a big downfall from less to SAS, is that if you miss a variable or you've got an extra closing bracket or semicolon, less will error out, and it could break your site. And I know if you use SAS and Compass and some of the other preprocessors, there's a little bit of error checking in terms of preventing that from happening, or warnings that that's going to happen. Now there's a couple little catches you can do if you're doing local host deployments, conversions, and then pushing that up online. But that is one thing. If you're running it in the browser and you're making edits to a less file on the fly, which you probably shouldn't do, but it does happen, you can take down the site because it doesn't know how to translate errors in the less file. And then performance. So like I said, it takes the less file, processes it, and basically appends it to the header. So if you look at the source code, you wouldn't see it in terms of if you could view source, but if you bring up Firebug or Inspector or anything like that, you'd actually see all of the styles have been injected into the head of the document that have been translated for you. And this is, again, running it on the client side. Now, you can also deploy less on the server side using Node.js. And there are some custom configs. You can do command line usage in terms of the file that should be outputted, some warnings, passing variables into the console, things like that. Personally, I'm not a Node guy, so I've not had a lot of experience doing deployments on the server side using Node. If you have, I definitely want to talk to you and how it works and find out a little bit more about it. I've either done deployment straight to the web, either on the client side, or the next area is processing less to CSS on your local host, on your own box. So what happens here is that instead of using less to translate in the browser the variables and mixins and things you're using, you essentially do the work manually. So this is great if you've got a testing environment or you're working in a team everybody's got their own testing environments. You've got that source code, so you're working with it. You're going to make changes to that less file, process it yourself using CodeKit, Live Recode, Compass. There's a whole list of them, or an online converter. Convert that less code into CSS and push that CSS up to the server. So there's some good and bad things to this. That you are spending more time in your local host. You are taking that file and processing that file, but it's a trade-off because you're going to be writing more CSS faster if you're using variables and mixins. So we're going to be a little honest here about why you should or shouldn't use less. First of all, you write less, and it's kind of a pun, the name of the topic, but it's true. So you can think about it in terms of, hey, look at that. So you can think about it in a number of different ways, but instead of writing, if you on average are writing these strings that are 1 line, 2 line, 3 lines of CSS code, you can call those up with a single word. And so that alone is going to make you faster if you're applying those same styles and the same archetypes throughout your design doc. And the second thing is it's fast. And I mean, it's really fast. I can't speak highly enough to that, but what I mean is the amount of CSS that you're able to write using less is, I would say, at least twice as fast, if not 3 times as fast, if you're not using that. And it's in terms of just copy and pasting, looking up those hex codes. Less can do a lot of work for you. And then the other thing, following up on that, color, size, and all the other variables that you set, those changes are easy. So what you can do is somebody says, I don't really like that light blue color. Let's change that to a dark blue. Or the borders aren't quite rounded enough. Let's change that from 5 pixels to 10 pixels. Well, if you've set that as a variable, if you've set that as a mixin, going up to your header and changing that in your CSS file, anytime that you're calling that same mixin or variable, it'll be updated in your entire document. So, there's a lot of blog articles that talk about Facebook and how Facebook had 700 declarations of the color blue. Well, if they were using less, then you change that blue in one place and it's updated all the way through. And there's also some debate in terms of if you're working in a team, how you deploy these, how you get on the same page in terms of the variables you're using and all of that. I've got the advantage because I work with a very small team of designers and developers, so there aren't a whole lot of people touching the front-end code, but there are a few of us. And as we've begun to grow, we've actually started, that's the thing we're going to talk about in terms of, do we like these mixins? Do we like these variables? Because if I'm writing something and I hand it off to Robert or anybody else, they've got to know what I'm writing. And so you've got to be very careful in terms of the code that you're writing, the variables that you're setting, and the mixins that you're using, because that can really confuse things. And then last note I will say is use the same variables and mixins on every project. And this is something that took me a little bit of time to get used to, because I've been writing CSS for such a long time. I had to get out of some bad habits in terms of copy and pasting, looking up hex codes, and then also learning, as I learned to use less, when to use a variable and when to use a mixin, because they are 2 different functions and they can do 2 really different things. So when I first started off, I defined my font sizes using EMs. I did those as variables instead of mixins. And so I basically set 2EM, 3EM, whatever. I've changed from that and I actually do that as a mixin now. And so what I do, I don't think I have a copy of it, but I essentially do it as a mixin and I say, if I call extra small will call font size 0.5 EM. Or if I do large, it'll do font size 2 EM, 3 EM, whatever. That standardization has helped me really, really speed up the front-end development that I've done. So here are some of the downsides, and again, being very honest here. Less does require JavaScript if you're using it as a front-end deployment. Like I said, you can't run less without JavaScript if you're doing it that way. So that's a killer for some people. To me, I personally don't think it's that big of a deal because most of the sites out there, for every project, we're deploying jQuery, we're deploying these JavaScript-dependent applications. So to me, it's not big of a deal. The next little note is that it's a known bug, but less does not play well on localhost. So if you're trying to pull up an index file using the actual file directory versus using MAMP or maybe even haven't tested it on Windows, but probably WAMP as well too. If you're calling up that index.html and that references the less JavaScript file, that's actually not going to render for you. And it's a known bug because Chrome actually has a security feature that doesn't allow you to do injections from JavaScript files. And it's a little bit over my head, but just know that you can't do it just by calling up a file. You need to do it in some type of directory. It's got to be a man power directory, or whatever PHP driven, or whatever your local host is powered by. So like I said, with any language, there's a learning curve, and this is something I experienced, is switching over to those mixins and those variables. You can't do it overnight, and it's going to take a little bit of testing and planning and find out what's right for you before you can really get it going. The next thing I would say is don't write mixins and variables that you can't remember. So don't write 42 pool mixin style. Write things you can remember in terms of black, red, green, small, medium, large. Simple words that might mean big things and might refer to big strings of code, but that it's easy to remember. So the next little note is talking about how mixins can actually be standalone classes. So if you're a small, for instance, and that mixin is calling a font size equals 2 EM or 1 EM, if you could actually call that class in your HTML and it will do the same thing that it's doing. So it's a little bit confusing because mixins look just like classes, but they're used in different ways. And then the last thing I would say is less, of course, is not always right for hands-on clients. So if you're writing CSS, if you're writing less, things you're going to hand off to a client, less might not be right because there is a learning curve with it, and it is something you're going to have to train people on and talk to people about. So the next thing I want to talk about just real kind of quickly is using less within a team. So if you're going to be writing a piece of code and you're going to be handing that off to a junior developer, a senior developer, and you're working in a team environment and everybody is going to be writing those same variables and mixins, even if you're on your dev box or even if you're on your production or whatever your method of deployment is relevant. You've got to make sure that everybody's writing the same variables and mixins because that can really be damaging if you're always injecting these new mixins and new variables to one CSS file. And similar to what I was saying a second ago, ramp up your less work slowly. So start with hex values. Start with things that are easy and things you don't want to repeat over and over again. And that'll really help how you adapt to the new style. Don't try and change everything overnight, obviously, and adapt your less style as your team grows and develops. So, there are some references in here in terms of, Mozilla has dropped their extension on several, box radius and shadow and all of that. So as those CSS elements progress and change, your less file needs to do that too. Because you don't need to be outputting code that is not relevant. Now there is some talk about, degrading gracefully and you want to output some of those older tags. You certainly can, and you're really not causing yourself any harm to include those older styles. Like I said earlier, stick with the pattern. Variables are variables and mixins are mixins. So I'm going to go back real quickly here as I kind of breezed over it. And I'm talking a little bit about setting these mixins. And so this is an example I pulled offline because it does it dynamically. Typically when in the default CSS file that we use for our front-end deployments, we've got a slew of mixins that we use. So we have 2 or 3 rows of variables, and those can be colors, those can be sizes, whatever. And then down below that, we've actually got a slew of mixins. So what we do is we standardize border radius, we standardize shadow. Same thing too, if you look back to the font setup, and this is where I think the power of less really is. If you look at the mixin, down the page where you start doing that style. Hopefully it won't buzz. You can take dim black as an example, and if that's a font style, and that's something, like, I don't know about you, but I don't want to type that 20 times in my CSS file. So all I need to do is turn that into a mix-in, throw in whatever variables I want, and that can be size, color, shape, shadow, you name it, and I just call it using one word. And so what happens is for H2, you could chain a whole bunch of those, you can chain a whole bunch of those mix-ins in terms of dim black. You could do a color, you could do a size, any kind of distortion or changes you want to do for less, you can chain those together. So you could have 5 or 6 different mix-ins, and those could output 10 lines of CSS code. And if that saves you time, then it's worthwhile. So I'm going to click back over to the end. So I want to talk a little bit about setting the story straight. Let me go to the next one actually. So there's other preprocessors, so let me start with that. Less is only one preprocessor. So you have Less, you have Sass, you have Compass, which is actually a framework based upon Sass that is loosely coupled with Ruby. And you have Stylus. Personally, I really don't like Stylus. Stylus does everything that Less does, it does everything that Sass does, but it gets rid of curly braces in your CSS code. So you define your elements, and then you define your declarations underneath it, and there's no brackets. So it can get really, really messy in terms of managing that style sheet down the line. But the first note I have is, don't believe everything you read online. Do your research, test things out. There are people who kick and scream and have a fit when they start talking about doing less deployments in the browser. It's a performance hit, all this nonsense. In some ways, if you're dealing with a CSS sheet that's 500 lines, 700 lines, 1,000 lines, first of all, you shouldn't be writing that much CSS code. But second of all, there isn't that big of a performance hit that I've ever seen. We've deployed it in production environments, and we've seen sub-second page load times. All you're requiring is that JavaScript go in, read that file, translate it, and put it in a header. And there is a little bit of time spent doing that, but it's not going to kill your server. It's not going to add 20 seconds to your load time. It's just another process that runs. It's just like loading jQuery, doing jQuery UI. Those things cost bandwidth. And if you're a performance nut, or you're serious about that, then doing deployments into production probably isn't right for you. So you have to look at using Node. You have to look at doing it locally, processing it. There are other options out there, and there's no reason to not use Less or Sass or Compass or Silence, any of these, because they can really, really speed up your development time on the front end. One thing I'll note is Less is a language, not a framework, and there is some confusion about this because Sass is the same way. Sass is a language, not a framework. Compass is a framework, not a language. Compass takes Sass and does the same thing that Sass does, only times 10. There's a bunch of built-in functions and awesome things you can do with Compass that you can't do with Less and Less and Stylus. But personally, that's overkill. I like Less because it is a language. It's very close to writing CSS code, and it's easy to pick up, easy to read, easy to understand, and you're not bloated by using this JavaScript file. The next note is JavaScript does not need Less does not need JavaScript. It only does if you're doing a browser deployment and you're relying on the JavaScript to translate it. Like I said, if you're running Node, that'll actually run on the server, or if you're doing it on your local box, translate on your local box and just throw in a CSS file to your server. No loss there. less is open-ended. The difference between less and Compass, for instance, is that less lets you do mixins and variables and hierarchy and all these pieces, but you make it what you want. So if you write a specific function that you need to use in the code, the style that you're writing, customize your code to use that function. SAS and especially Compass, I feel like in a way pigeonhole you in terms of the functions you can run, the widgets I guess you can use within Compass. And if you're a SAS person, if you're a Compass person, or even stylist, I definitely want to talk to you and kind of compare notes in terms of the different systems. I've looked at them. Pretty much the style is the same, the functions are the same, but it's really personal preference when you get down to it. And like I said earlier, do your own tests, do your research, download these. They're all free, they're all easy to use, so download them and play around with them, do some customizations and see which framework, which preprocessor is right for you. So that's it.